When Yellowstone erupts, survivors will face another danger in the form of an ash cloud that will spread around the country, burying everything in sight under tons of gray ash and killing off most life in its path. So where would be the best place to survive the Yellowstone eruption? Let's take a look at the scenarios for different regions after the ash cloud hits. We'll start with the area immediately surrounding the park, which is actually the least affected region when it comes to ash. That's because while the blast wave from the initial eruption will flatten trees and demolish buildings within the park and nearby towns, the actual amount of ash that falls in this region will be relatively small compared to other areas. You see, after the initial blast, a pyroclastic flow will race down the slopes of the mountains surrounding the caldera, taking most of the ash with it. The areas closer to the river valleys are likely to experience the greatest amount of ashfall, but even then, it probably won't exceed more than a few inches. For perspective, during the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington, ash fell to a depth of 2 feet in some areas. But here, the total thickness of the ash layer will be determined by several factors, such as the strength of winds at different altitudes. And the further away from the volcano you are, the less dense the ash will be. In fact, the impact of an eruption on local ecosystems may not be great enough to have lasting consequences. And so, in general, this region will be one of the better places to be if you want to survive the Yellowstone eruption. However, things get drastically worse as we move further east. When the massive amount of ash created by the eruption reaches the Great Plains, it will bury the landscape in a thick layer of ash, bringing agriculture to a screeching halt and causing massive damage to the economy. This region is very sparsely populated, though, so there won't be many human casualties. As far as which states will be affected, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado will experience the most significant ash fallout. Cities like Billings, Bozeman, and Missoula in Montana, as well as Rapid City in South Dakota, will likely be buried under several feet of ash. But the ash cloud won't stop at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Eventually, it will reach all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. While the ash will be much thinner over such a large area, it will still smother crops and contaminate water sources, leading to food shortages and health issues. So, what about the Northeast Megalopolis, the densely populated region that stretches from Boston to Washington, D.C.? Would the ash cloud bury this region in a thick layer of ash, or would the particles simply mix with clouds and rain back to the earth? Well, actually, both things will happen. Some ash will indeed fall from the sky like snow, but this will only occur in some places. A paper published in 2023 used a computer model to simulate the fallout of a hypothetical eruption of the same size as the one that formed the Yellowstone caldera. The results showed that the ash cloud would spread rapidly across the central and eastern U.S., reaching as far east as the Atlantic coast within 2 days. During this time, some of the ash would fall as ash snow over the Appalachian Mountains, especially in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. The researchers estimated that these areas could receive up to 6 inches of ashfall, which could suffocate many people in the densely populated corridor. Meanwhile, some ash would mix with the water vapor in the air and reach the East Coast as acid rain, posing a serious threat to the region's large cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. In these areas, the ash concentration in the atmosphere is predicted to be high enough to cause respiratory problems and other health issues for those who venture outside. Additionally, the ash would contaminate water sources, destroy crops, and disrupt air travel. The economic impact on these major cities could be catastrophic. And now, let's turn our attention to the Pacific Northwest, specifically Seattle and Portland. These 2 cities are located just outside the area most affected by the ash cloud. However, they are still expected to experience significant disruptions due to a combination of ashfall and acid rain. As mentioned earlier, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens deposited 2 feet of ash in some areas around the volcano. If the entire Pacific Northwest were covered in a similar layer of ash, it would devastate the region's economy. Crops would be wiped out and major highways would become impassable. In fact, The damage caused by volcanic ash is so severe that military bases in the area would likely be evacuated. Seattle and Portland, being the largest cities in the Pacific Northwest, would be particularly vulnerable. They are situated near the coast, which means that the prevailing winds would carry ash directly towards them. And unlike the Rocky Mountains, the Cascades don't act as a natural barrier to stop the ash cloud. So the ashfall in these cities could be even greater than 2 feet. At the same time, some ash would also dissolve in rainwater and fall back to the ground in the form of acid rain. It would pose risks to human health, damage crops, contaminate water sources, and disrupt air traffic. If the cities are caught off guard, thousands could perish from inhaling toxic ash. But if you want to have the best chance of survival, you should head further north. The state of Alaska is the safest place to be during the Yellowstone eruption. But why is that? To answer that question, let's look at what happens to the ash cloud as it moves further east and south. Once the ash cloud reaches the Atlantic Ocean, some of the particles will dissolve in seawater, contaminating marine life and altering ocean currents. This will affect weather patterns across the globe, potentially causing global cooling and disrupting agricultural production worldwide. But that's not the reason why Alaska is the best place to be. It's because the prevailing winds in Alaska blow mostly from west to east, meaning that the ash cloud will pass through the state relatively quickly. Most of the ash will fall over the ocean, but some of it will inevitably make its way inland. However, the good news is that Alaska is sparsely populated, so there won't be many people in the way of the ash cloud. Plus, the state is huge, so you'll have plenty of space to bug out into the wilderness if your town gets too dangerous to stay in. Just be careful not to accidentally inhale any ash while you're out exploring. Also, it might be a good idea to stay away from the coastline, as the ash will likely accumulate there. Instead, try to head further inland towards the interior of the state where the ashfall will be less dense. The next best place to be would be Hawaii. Why? Because it's far away from the eruption site and its ash cloud. It's also isolated geographically, meaning that the ash cloud will have a hard time reaching the islands. However, there is a catch. The eruption will likely trigger a tsunami, which could hit the Hawaiian coast. So if you decide to bug out to Hawaii, make sure to stay away from the coast. Otherwise, you could get swept away by a powerful wave. But what if you can't evacuate and must shelter in place? Then you need to find a location inside the danger zone that has a radiation shield to protect you from the initial blast, such as a basement or a cave. Basements are preferable because caves can collapse when the ground shakes. But you need to be aware of the potential for pyroclastic flows if you choose to stay in a basement. So what if you live in the Northeast Megalopolis and can't get out in time? Your best bet would be to stay in a windowless basement or sub-basement and seal it off as best as possible with plastic sheeting and duct tape. Even if the room isn't completely sealed, it will still offer some protection from ash and toxic gases. But if you have the resources, it's a better idea to relocate to a rural area outside the ash zone where you can grow your own food and avoid contaminated water sources. Surviving the aftermath of a Yellowstone eruption will require careful planning and preparation. Whether you choose to stay in your current location or evacuate will depend on many factors, including your geographic location and access to resources. No matter what you decide, you must stay informed about the situation and follow the advice of local authorities. Thank you for watching.